Welcome to The Thing About Austen, a podcast about Jane Austen's world. I'm Zan.
And I'm Diane. And this episode, we're talking about muslin. We are thrilled to welcome our guest today, Dr. Hilary Davidson. Hilary Davidson is a dress, textiles, and fashion historian and curator. She is the chair and faculty member of the Fashion and Textile Studies Department at New York's Fashion Institute of Technology. Hilary earned her PhD in archaeology from La Trobe University in Melbourne and also holds a MA in the history of textiles and dress from the University of Southampton in England. Her professional experience includes work as curator of fashion and textiles for the Museum of London, and she is the author of 2 books and several book and journal chapters focusing on Regency fashion, including Dress in the Age of Jane Austen and the forthcoming Jane Austen's Wardrobe, both from Yale University Press. Welcome, Hilary!
Hi, thank you for having me.
We're so glad to have you. So before we start in on our conversation, we will kind of set the scene. We are starting the conversation with Northanger Abbey, and Mrs. Allen and Catherine Morland have had a disappointing first night out in Bath at the Upper Assembly Rooms, but things are looking up for our heroine on her second outing to the lower rooms. She has been introduced to the oh-so-charming Henry Tilney, and during their first dance together, they are interrupted by Mrs. Allen, who is in need of assistance. So here we get the text. "My dear Catherine," she said, "do take this pin out of my sleeve. I'm afraid it has torn a hole already. I shall be quite sorry if it has, for it is a favourite gown, though it costs but 9 shillings a yard." "That's exactly what I should have guessed it, madam," said Mr. Tilney, looking at the muslin. "Do you understand muslins, sir?" "Particularly well. I always buy my own cravats, and I'm allowed to be an excellent judge. And my sister has often trusted me in the choice of a gown. I bought one for her the other day, and it was pronounced to be a prodigious bargain by every lady who saw it. I gave but 5 shillings a yard for it, and a true Indian muslin." Mrs. Allen was quite struck by his genius. That last line is just, I love it so much. She is so impressed.
She is in awe of his knowledge. So, Hilary, to get us started, can you just tell us a little bit about what muslin is as a textile, particularly during this time period?
Well, muslin at this point is a fine, generally white, sort of light, quite open weave fabric. And technically, muslin is the yarn, so the thread that makes up the textile, and then it can be woven into types of muslin, so a cambric muslin or a jaconet muslin. And this is a textile that's been woven in various areas of India, particularly Bengal, for thousands of years. And it's been imported slowly into Europe over that time. But it really increased imports into Europe with the rise of the East India Company throughout particularly the 17th and 18th century. And so by about the 1780s, you start to see muslin increasing in fashion for women's dresses. And it's this light, airy, kind of floaty fabric. I think in current American usage, it's something that's called mull, because the word muslin has been used for what in British and Australian usage is called calico, that kind of plain fabric. So just sort of clarify that for any US listeners. But this light, floaty, delicate, also sort of slightly translucent fabric is quite a contrast to the crisp silks and the taffetas and brocades that have comprised elite European dress for this time. And so from the late 18th century onwards, we see a rise in muslin amongst, I'm not going to say every day, but middle class and above people's clothing. So we're talking about a cotton fabric. There's some linen, but traditionally it's made of cotton that has the threads that are in it are very fine, and it's sort of airy and elegant and envelops the wearer.
Well, and it's a craft that's kind of specialized in India. I mean, it's not just coming from India, but there's like a whole craft behind it, right? That there's this skill set that only a true Indian muslin would be able to replicate?
Exactly. And at this point as well, because it is coming from India, there's all these conditions that make the finest muslins. So you have to kind of keep the thread wet. It has to be a certain kind of the fine cotton plant that creates it. The weavers who make it, they have to work in quite damp conditions in order to keep the thread elastic enough to weave it. And I mean, the very, very finest muslins, you can see your hand through.
Oh.
They're incredible. They used to be called woven air. What's also happening concurrently with the popularity of muslins is that European manufacturers are going, wait a second, we're losing a lot of our market to this imported fabric. We'd like a bit of this action, please. So they're trying to imitate the imported Indian version. And as the East India Company, which is basically a corporation running without check or control in India, as their economic power rises, Britain is more and more concerned about being able to compete with the muslin industry. So the East India Company, through the very late and 18th and early 19th century, are putting more economic checks and controls on muslin production to give British manufacturers a chance to imitate the real thing. And they're trying to do by machine what in India has been done by hand for centuries. So there's this incredible kind of industrial textile economic race happening at exactly the time that Jane Austen is writing Northanger Abbey. So whether something is a true Indian muslin or a slightly inferior British, possibly French imitation muslin is quite a distinction for the Regency consumer who can see the difference instantly.
Okay. So we don't know if Mrs. Allen's dress here is a true Indian muslin, but we know that Henry at least is able to spot the differences.
Or do we? Is he pulling
intrigue.
our legs? This is the question. You know, this passage is often taken at face value, but this is Jane Austen we're talking about here. And it's not quite clear whether Henry Tilney is actually telling the truth or if he's kind of ribbing Mrs. Allen slightly, and she hasn't worked it out.
Yeah.
And it's quite hard to kind of get into the economic nitty-gritty of whether he is or not, because there's often quite a lot of variation in muslin prices. And if at this point true Indian muslins were quite cheap comparatively, and it's not until the 19th century that the price is raised. So I think it's between about 1806 and 1818, the tariff import costs on Indian muslins are raised 9 times in those years in order to protect the British manufacturing. So I've got to say,
You're suspicious
I'm
of
not
this.
quite sure about Henry Tilney here. He certainly understands what muslins are used for, but he might be pulling Mrs. Allen's leg and therefore our legs.
Right. Which fits with his character. I mean, it does.
Oh,
right?
yes.
He's just cheeky enough.
He's a tease.
And the fact that we all also know that Mrs. Allen is incredibly gullible
Absolutely.
and like not paying attention to things. So the fact that she's struck with his
Exactly.
genius here makes that work, I think.
But some of the things as well, like the fact that he buys his own muslin for cravats that he could buy for his sister, this is totally commensurate with shopping habits of the Regency gentry in this period. Men could absolutely go shopping, and if he was in Bath when his sister was not, most families were involved in the practice of proxy shopping, where you commission someone you know, generally a family member, if they're going into town, into London or Bath, or even just, your nearest big town, can you please get me these things because you're there? And so that Henry Tilney shops for textiles for his sister is totally plausible. And in fact, in line with the shopping habits of the time, which all of the Austen family were involved in proxy shopping, and lots of the letters between Jane and Cassandra are doing exactly that, commissioning purchases when one of the others is in Bath or London.
So he knows enough that Eleanor can trust him to pick out some good fabric.
Exactly. And he probably could. I mean, I would say he probably could tell the difference between a true Indian and a British muslin, because Regency consumers were very alert to the materiality of what they were buying. And they knew the hand of things. They were kind of haptic shoppers, as you call it academically. And they were accustomed to touching what they were buying and really kind of being alert to fine nuances of quality, because, clothing had to last longer. Textiles were more expensive. So they were really invested in the nuances and lasting quality of what they were buying. So even Mrs. Allen fussing about that hole in her sleeve, once muslin's torn, any repairs to it are visible. So she's still trying to protect, even though it's just 9 shillings a yard, which is really quite expensive. That's more than a silk at the time. She doesn't want it to get ruined.
Yeah.
What is funny how Tilney seems to really kind of key in on the pricing, and he's like a savvy bargain hunter.
Yeah, absolutely. And even the nuances between what makes a 5 shilling muslin, if it does, I'm just going to add a little grain of salt there metaphorically, or a 9 shilling muslin, that he would be completely alert to. Even if it was like a 5 to a 6 shilling muslin, is it worth that price difference? Is someone trying to sort of rip you off? If you went to the other store just next door, could you get the same one for slightly cheaper?
Well, and it's interesting too, because in this same kind of passage, there's a part where Mrs. Allen turns to Tilney and says, like, okay, what do you think of Catherine's gown? And he does talk about the way that it's going to wear, the way that it's going to, is it going to fray, these sorts of things. Like he's very much so, again, attuned to not just, the quality, but the way it's going to wear, the way, how much use are you going to get out of it? He even talks about, like, Eleanor will be like, oh, I bought too much, but I can always turn it into something else.
Exactly. And I think for me, that passage also reads about his closeness with his sister, because it sounds like he's talked about this with her. Their mother's dead. She's the only other kind of close female person in the family. He's got an older brother and a father you're not going to be chatting about muslin with, let's be honest. So, it sounds like he's talked about this with his sister, that he's sort of paid attention, because one of his qualities is that he listens and he is interested. He can hold a conversation with someone like Mrs. Allen, and he might be ribbing her, but it's compassionate and kind. So I think it also says something about Tilney's character too, that he's had conversations about dresses coming back from the laundry with someone who we must assume is his sister.
Yeah.
And so it's telling us a little bit about his character too.
I love that. Their relationship is obviously very close. We see that throughout the text. But I love that, yes, if he's this attuned to it, it's because most likely, he and Eleanor have that kind of relationship.
Yeah. And also that pragmatism that, can always be turned to something else, a cap or a scarf or something like that. It's true. And you see muslin appearing in all sorts of things, and that sense of reusing and recycling, that's absolutely mapping onto what we see in the material record of how Regency consumers use muslin.
I'm kind of curious, because of this discussion that they're having and the way, again, that Tilney's very cognizant of the price and the wear, what sort of reputation did muslin as a textile have during this time period? Was it a frivolous fabric? Was it a luxury fabric? You said that it was sort of middle class and above, like everybody was wearing it. So was it fairly accessible? Like, who was muslin for?
I mean, what's really remarkable about muslin is it's the first, roughly the first strong example of a less luxury or elite fiber becoming an elite product. So this is the beginning of the change to a cotton regime in European culture. So whereas silk had dominated elite dress, and I'm talking by elite, I mean sort of, the gentry middling class and above. We're talking the top kind of 20, maybe 25% of a population going up to the aristocracy. And muslin, I mean, the controversy about the portrait of, say, Marie Antoinette, the Queen of France, who was painted in a muslin gown in, I think it's 1783 by Elizabeth Vigée-Lebrun. People were scandalized because the Queen was depicted in something that looked slightly like underwear, so it was often called, a chemise dress or a chemise à la reine. But this is not appropriate fabric for a queen. Muslin it wasn't the done thing. It was not of an appropriate rank. And the power of aristocratic trendsetters like Marie Antoinette and her circle, like Georgiana, the Duchess of Devonshire, or Mary Perdita Robinson, who was the first person to wear it in Britain in 1782, this sort of new style. And as well as the kind of, the change to a sort of simpler styles in dress is often associated with the French Revolution, but it's part of like bigger changes happening throughout society. So by the 1790s, muslin had become one of the dominant fabrics for dresses, and it would keep increasing that dominance. So it was more accessible in terms of product to buy. It was still had a luxury status to it, not least because of its fragility. there's maintenance and upkeep involved in muslin. You have to be able to wash it to keep it clean because it's white. You have to be able to mend it because it tears really easily. Like in Pride and Prejudice, where Lydia sends home and says, tell Sally, the servant, to mend the great slit in my worked muslin gown. So there's housemaids can't wear it. Again, there's that reference in Mansfield Park where Mrs. Norris is very pleased that the housekeeper at the other great house doesn't let the housemaids wear white. So although it's sort of often seen as a democratizing fashion, and cotton becoming something that was worn as an outer garment absolutely was, but often it's the pleated, strong cottons that are worn by sort of lower middle class and working class women, and muslin becomes, as it were, an elite cotton. And by the mid-1790s, it's become quite sort of normalized in dress, but its real kind of powerhouse of popularity is about 1795 to really about 1820.
Okay.
And during that time, you see the switch over from the dominance of Indian to the dominance of British muslins. As the British muslins get cheaper, they become more accessible, but it's still not an everyday fabric. And there is a kind of a social elite attachment to that, while it also becomes quite normalized within that group.
Okay.
If that makes sense.
Yeah. So because this is such a light material, this is something, again, you've talked about the way it wears and worrying about it fraying. I'm assuming that, and you also mentioned Marie Antoinette's somewhat kind of scandalizing everyone because it's such a light kind of fabric. Was this often layered in dress because you couldn't?
All the time.
Okay.
And this is one of the, I think, the things that's, the Regency period's clothing has a number of kind of great clothing myths attached to it. First of all, the one is that women dampened their muslin gowns, which I have never found any evidence for.
Okay.
What you have is people saying, because the idea is that, you dampened your gown and then it clung to the body and you could see everything in this kind of, transparency. But we're dealing with a fabric that does cling. I mean, if you've ever worn muslin, it's quite staticky, right? So it does kind of cling to itself. And period reports say it looks as if it was damped, but they're not saying it was dampened, because also what are you going to do? Like carry a spray board around with you all night for when it dries out? Like, it's actually impractical if you think about it for 3 seconds. But the idea of its translucency and transparency is part of what I think of the great kind of visual illusions of the Regency, because what a lot of clothing is doing is trying to make it look as if you're naked underneath, but you're definitely not ever naked underneath.
Got all that structure underneath going on.
Yeah, there's always things under there. And then we see, first of all, in France, they were a bit more risque than they were in Britain. So we see these portraits of people like Madame Récamier, where she's kind of got, she's barely dressed in muslin, and it's sort of just like these wisps over her bosom. But even where it looks like, for example, a woman isn't wearing a corset, corsets were cut to look like they weren't wearing corsets. So they usually are, because you don't get that amazing, lift and separate 2 oranges on a plate kind of Regency bosom without something helping you underneath, generally.
Yeah.
And once you know what to look for, you can start to see like how they're doing it so that it looks like it's an illusion. And it's pretty much the same with petticoats and things underneath. There are reports that say some Parisian women would wear pink silk knitted body stockings to match the tone of their flesh, so that, the illusion. But, it's only in kind of caricatures and exaggerations that we see this kind of, the whole sort of joke on bombazine instead of bombazine, and the notion that it's totally transparent. But when you look at what people are doing, there's always something underneath. And if we take a few fashion outliers, it's like looking, if someone in 100 years' time was looking back and saying, oh, everybody dressed like Kim Kardashian. She's a very elite person who pushes fashion in a certain way, and it's part of her persona, and it's part of what makes her notable. But that's not what, we're wearing to get around in. And so when you look at what most people are wearing and how most women are wearing muslin, they're wearing petticoats and chemises and corsets underneath it.
Yeah.
And it might be, it's more clinging and soft than stiffer 18th century dress, but you're certainly not showing everything you've got to the world. You're striking a fine balance between being beautifully dressed and, revealing such charms as are appropriate to the situation in which you are.
Oh, I think that's fantastic.
Such charms as are appropriate. I love that.
That's good. Yeah.
I also just 2 oranges on a plate. That's an image that's going to stay with me for a while.
It should do. You've got 2 separate globes that just like lift and separate, but they've always got a gap between them. This whole kind of what I think of as 2 loaves of bread dough smushed together with the line between them, which is the modern idea of cleavage. You often see this so Bridgerton, for example, has what I think of as bread dough cleavage.
Okay.
But when you actually look at what the Regency does, it's 2 orange cleavage. And it's, 2 distinct breasts. And this is quite an innovation in the Regency period by comparison with the kind of the single monobosom 18th century style that gives you that kind of line down the middle, what we think of as cleavage. But it's there's a subtle difference. And I never thought I'd be saying Regency cleavage expert on a CV, but here you go.
Check mark.
Yes.
Got that one.
Yep. Absolutely. The skill nobody knew they needed.
And was there a difference at all between the sort of muslin worn for day wear versus the type of muslin gown that you would wear in the evening?
Absolutely. There's lots and lots of different kinds of muslin. In India, there's over 100 different kinds that are woven. So it can be from this completely, almost completely transparent, the finest, most expensive, to something that is only slightly transparent, what we might think of as like a lawn today. And so within that as well, you would have muslins that could have patterns woven in, which in India areas is called the Jamdani technique. So you could have, decorative patterns that are actually part of the weave. And then you could also have chikan muslins, which is where the pattern is embroidered in. And so many of the things that we think of as kind of typical Regency decorative muslins, like, a spotted muslin or a sprigged muslin. Well, a spotted muslin is actually the Doruka technique. And it's just that name, that Indian originating name, just gets erased. So you could also have muslins that were, so you could have a plain muslin for day or a jaconet muslin or the cambric muslin, which had a kind of a polish to it. And then how that was decorated, you would have the more fanciful ones for the evening. So it could be embroidered often white on white, but sometimes color on white or multicolor on white, often with the tambour technique, which is kind of chain stitching with a hook. And then there are absolutely stunning gold and silver embroidered muslins that just, glitter in the candlelight as it would have been. And so you've got this incredible sort of light textile contrasting with a kind of a richness of silver gilt or gold gilt decoration and often little sequins, so little sort of metal spangles. So this kind of gold encrusted cotton is a whole new thing. And you could have really quite exceptional and splendid muslins or very, very finely embroidered ones. So there is a full spectrum of what you can buy, not just along the price, but in the finish and how splendid that is.
Because if I'm remembering correctly, there's in Mansfield Park, when Fanny wears her dress for her coming out, Edmund's like, ooh, he's admiring the glossy spots on it.
Yes.
So I'm assuming that's kind of what this is describing here.
Exactly. A glossy spot would probably be satin stitch embroidered, because when you weave it in, it's not so glossy. So if it's a glossy spot, something's been done on the outside, and it, he might have used shiny if it was a metallic one, but Fanny's very modest. And as he says, a woman can never be too fine in white, which I find really interesting because that's the same novel where Mrs. Norris points out very clearly that a woman can indeed be too fine in white if she's not at the right social level. So, it's no woman, Edmund, could be too fine in white, but...
Well, who are going to take our fashion advice from? I mean, both of them are a little bit suspicious.
Yeah, exactly. In that novel, Mary Crawford, no
100%.
question. She'd be like,
she knows
the
what
one
she's
we
doing. Yes. Well, so, if we're talking about shopping and this fine dress and things like that, when Mrs. Allen and Catherine arrive in Bath, the very first thing they do is go to the shops looking for new gowns. And as we see at the scene that we used to kind of set up the episode, muslin gowns are something Mrs. Allen is very passionate about. We also get a scene later in the novel when Catherine actually loses sleep thinking about which muslin she's going to wear the next time she sees Mr. Tilney. Why do you think Austen gives muslin this much narrative space in this novel? I mean, Northanger Abbey seems to be particularly obsessed with muslin. Why do you think Austen does that? What's going on here?
I think Northanger Abbey is a really, really interesting novel in this sense because of the length of time between its genesis and its publication. So it appears to have been drafted in the late 1790s. Austen's in her early 20s. This is the same period so she does First Impressions, which becomes Pride and Prejudice. She does Eleanor and Marianne, which becomes Sense and Sensibility, and she becomes Susan. That becomes Northanger Abbey. But it doesn't get published until after her death in 1818. So what we have is a novel that is ostensibly an 1818 novel, but in fact maps over the period of muslin's greatest popularity and where muslin is like the new fashion fabric. And Northanger Abbey is the most directly chatty about clothes of all Austen's novels. So for me, the obsession with muslin, because it's true, it appears, far more in here than anything else, is kind of, it's a mark of her juvenilia. When you look at the juvenilia that she wrote beforehand, which is hilariously funny and like rip-snortingly laugh out loud funny. And it's often kind of making jokes about muslin and textiles and things like that. And she's writing when she's in her 20s, which she's very alert to fashion in her 20s. It's also the period where, sort of 1795 to 1800, muslin is it. Muslin is like this new fashionable fabric. It's what everybody's wearing. So I think what we see in Northanger Abbey is this marker of muslin's grasp on fashion. It's the sort of the time where it becomes a little white dress of the upper class woman. We also hear a lot about greatcoats and kind of hat details and things like that. So I think this is kind of an example of Austen's youthful writing responding to the world in which she's living at that time, where she's wearing fashion and muslin is super fashionable, and she's spending like quite a lot of time in Bath too. So I think it's really interesting like that. It's kind of a palimpsest or an excavation of time that's very reflective of the moment in which it was created.
Yeah. Fashion was on her mind. This was like, it was the fashion of the time. So it makes sense that it would come up a lot.
And it's Northanger Abbey's got that fabulous passage about fashion is at all times a frivolous distinction. And, basically she's saying women, it's far more important to women than it is to men. And if, women knew how little men cared about it, which also, is playing off against the Tilney thing. And like Austen, it's firmly tongue in cheek. But, I think, what if Austen stayed awake all night one night saying, well, I don't know which muslin to wear. It's she angst slightly about muslins in her letters at this time. So I'm hoping that's from personal experience.
I mean, who hasn't been stressed about what are they going to wear to a certain event?
Especially when it's someone you like, someone you want to impress. Yeah. It feels very authentic. Yeah.
And who can, when everyone can read muslins, like which muslin you're going to wear is going to make a difference. Are you going to wear the sprigged or the spotted or the gold or the minute differences of quality made a difference?
That's so true, because you talked earlier about how, it would have been very typical for a Regency consumer to really be able to recognize price and quality. So then, if you go to an event, everyone's going to know if you're wearing the bargain basement muslin.
Well, and again, she's also aware that like Tilney reads muslin, and he's the one she's trying to impress. So
and whether he's telling the truth or not, that's irrelevant, because he's shown her that he can read muslin in some way, and that's just like not am I gonna like wear clothes to impress the boy I like, but he knows exactly what I'm wearing. Like he's gonna know if I'm wearing counterfeit Gucci rather than real Gucci. It's
pressure. There's a lot of pressure here.
My knockoff muslin.
Yeah, exactly. This is the Zara version, not the catwalk version. And now I feel anxious, actually. I'm like, oh God, what muslin would I be wearing? This is,
Who hasn't received an invitation for something like a wedding and you're looking at the dress code and you're just like, okay, I don't want to be overdressed, but I definitely don't want to be underdressed.
Which of my muslins is smart casual?
Yes, exactly.
I really feel for Catherine in this moment, just laying awake at night.
And then it doesn't help that she's got Isabella Thorpe traipsing around as well, with all her London fashion knowledge.
Yes.
And, ready to kind of jump in a kind of passive-aggressive critique at any moment. Yeah, that's not helping her either. Plus, Mrs. Allen, her chaperone, who all she can think about is clothes.
Right.
So if they go out in the evening, you know that all Mrs. Allen is going to be talking about is whether Catherine's chosen the right muslin or not. How can she sleep at all, frankly?
This is consuming all of her time, really. I mean, it's novels and muslin. That's all she's got time for.
Yeah.
Well, all of this discussion of muslin in Austen's novels definitely demonstrates, like you said, that she had her own keen eye for dress and fashion of the time that she was living in. And your forthcoming book, Jane Austen's Wardrobe, touches on all of this. So can you tell us a bit more about the book? When can we get our hands on it?
Absolutely. Would you like the long story or the short story of the book's genesis?
I think we want the long story.
Long,
yes.
obviously.
I hoped you'd say that. Yeah, I wouldn't have asked really unless I thought you were going to say that. So it was the pandemic, I think 2020. And I, for various reasons that are too long to go into, ended up in a cottage in rural Wales. So I was puttering around trying to teach long distance in Sydney and doing various things. And as I was puttering around one day, working on something for Jane Austen's letters, the idle thought floated through my head. I wonder why nobody's written a book just looking at what Jane Austen wore, taking the information from the letters. And then I went, wait a second. I wonder why nobody has done this. This is you just go through the letters and look at, all the tiny references to this is what she wore. And you could sort of reconstruct some of Jane Austen's wardrobe with that. And then I went, wait a second. And then there are real things that she wore that you could put in with that. And there we are. I mocked up a couple of pages of, what I thought this book would look like, just examining basically what we can know Jane Austen wore based on her letters and her surviving objects. It's a pretty straightforward idea, but it goes through systematically. And while lots of people have looked at sort of what Austen wore and used the letters as a source, I mean, my first book is really mines these. This one just focuses on how much information we can extract about what Austen was wearing based on very, very small references. Because, I mean, as I'm sure most of your listeners know, only 161 of her estimated 3,000 letters survive.
Yeah.
And so that's what I did. I've just gone through chronologically, and we ended up deciding to organize it more like a wardrobe, just to kind of keep things together. So all of the sections are parts of a wardrobe. So all of her gowns are in the clothes press, all of her shoes are on the shelves, all of her jewelry's in a jewelry box, and the chapters are organized that way. But it's basically a page of images and then the reference from the letters and then explaining what's going on in this, and then also incorporating the things that we know, or pretty sure we know that she owned, like her pelisse, which I've studied a lot, her turquoise ring, her turquoise bracelet, the topaz crosses. And it turns out this is also the first time that all of these objects will have been published together. So that's also really exciting too.
Yeah.
We've got kind of bits and pieces out, but they've never actually all been in a book together. So that's what the next book is, Jane Austen's Wardrobe.
It's going to be fabulous. What a great resource.
Yeah. And when can we get our hands on this? This is important.
Well, I'm not sure. Pre-orders, I think, will probably open in August, but the publication date is September the 12th, 2023.
Okay. So coming up soon.
And it is through Yale University Press, so it'll be simultaneously in the US, UK, and worldwide. And, you can get it through your preferred book purveyor channel.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much for taking the time out of your schedule to do this with us.
It's absolutely my pleasure. Although I am much more anxious about Catherine Morland than ever I was before.
Right?
So.
Now we have to worry for Catherine in a way that we've never had to worry for her before.
Poor thing, just laying awake at night, cycling through her wardrobe.
Her wardrobe cycles. Yep.
Mm-hmm. So, Hilary, where can our listeners find you online and follow along with you and probably get updates on the book publication?
Absolutely. I do have a website, www.hilarydavidson.net, and that's Hilary with one L, which I will update at some point. I'm also available on social media, Twitter or Instagram. My handle is @4redshoes, and that's the number spelled out. And both my first book, Dress in the Age of Jane Austen, and the second book, Jane Austen's Wardrobe, can be found on their own Twitter account @AustenDress. So I'm just keeping on going for the second one and for the first one. So any kind of dedicated book news, I'll be putting on there.
Perfect.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Hilary. It has been an absolute delight to chat with you.
My pleasure.
Thank you again to Dr. Hilary Davidson for joining us for this discussion on muslin. And as sort of a companion to this episode, if you haven't already had a chance to do so, we definitely recommend that you listen to our episode on the East India Company with our guest, Sharmini Kumar. You can find us on Instagram at The Thing About Austen and on Twitter at Austen_things. You can also check out our website, thethingaboutausten.com, and email us at thethingaboutausten@gmail.com.
Stay tuned for our next episode, where we will be talking about Anne Elliot's Bloom.
Thanks for listening.
Bye.